In a quiet village nestled between towering trees and winding forest paths, life had always been simple. Farmers worked the fields, mothers called children home from play, and the sounds of laughter and song filled the air. But lately, a shadow had fallen over the village of Dunford. Children had begun to disappear, taken in the dead of night by a presence only spoken of in whispers, a figure known as the Shadow. No one had seen his face, but tales of a dark figure lurking at the forest's edge haunted the villagers, turning their peaceful lives into a waking nightmare. Emory, a humble woodsman, had lived on the edge of this forest his whole life. Known for his quiet strength and kindness, he was often the first to lend a hand when his neighbors needed help. But he was no warrior, and the stories of the Shadow chilled him as they did everyone else. Every night, he would close the shutters of his small cabin, hoping that the darkness would pass, that life would return to the way it had been. Then, one cold autumn night, a frantic knock came at his door. It was Miriam, one of his neighbors, her face pale with fear. She clutched his arm, her voice trembling as she spoke the words he dreaded most. "They've taken Alice, my little girl." She was there one moment, and the next gone. The weight of her words settled heavily on Emory. He had watched Alice grow, her laughter a bright spark in the village. The thought of her, lost in the dark forest, alone and frightened, sent a chill through him. Looking into Miriam's tear-filled eyes, Emory felt something shift within him, an unyielding resolve, a courage he hadn't known he possessed. "I'll bring her back," he promised, his voice low but firm. "I don't know what's lurking out there, but I'll find her and I'll bring her home." Arming himself only with his worn hunting knife and a bag of provisions, Emory set off into the darkness. The forest, once a familiar friend, now seemed filled with shadows that reached for him, whispering threats of danger. But Emory walked on, guided by his promise and the faint hope that he might save the children who had vanished before more were lost. As Emory ventured deeper into the woods, the familiar trees around him seemed transformed, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows across his path. The forest, once a place of work and solace, felt different, hostile, as though it had been touched by something dark and unnatural. He pressed on, each step heavier, feeling the weight of Miriam's plea and the memory of Alice's laughter urging him forward. In the quiet village of Dunford, life carried on as it always had. Farmers tilled the land, blacksmiths shaped iron, and families gathered at dusk, warmed by hearts and familiar voices. In this village lived Emory, a humble woodsman with calloused hands and a quiet resolve. Known for his kindness, he often shared his meager earnings with those who had less, and his gentle nature made him a beloved figure among the villagers. Yet, recent days had cast a shadow over Dunford. Whispers of fear and grief spread through the market square as parents held their children close, eyes darting over their shoulders. The air itself seemed thick with unease, clinging to every cottage and cottage door. For the children were disappearing, one by one, without a trace. At first, the people thought it was simply bad fortune. Perhaps a wandering bear or the treacherous woods had claimed them. But as the disappearances continued, the villagers' suspicion turned to dread. Rumors of a dark figure roaming the outskirts of the village began to circulate. People spoke of the Shadow, a figure cloaked in darkness, seen only briefly, slipping between the trees at nightfall. The few who had glimpsed him described a hooded figure, moving with unnatural silence, watching, waiting. Emory knew these children. He had watched them grow, heard their laughter fill the narrow streets of Dunford, and shared in the simple joys of their lives. But as the shadow of fear grew, even Emory's heart grew heavy, burdened by helplessness. He had no family of his own. The village was all he held dear. The thought of losing even one more child to this unknown darkness gnawed at him, and he felt the burden of a duty that weighed upon his very soul. Then one bitter night it happened. Emory was preparing to rest when a frantic knock came at his door. Outside stood Miriam, his neighbor, eyes red and filled with terror. "Emory," she gasped, clutching his arm. "They've taken Alice, my Alice." Alice, the small girl with a laugh that could melt winter itself, had vanished. Emory's chest tightened, and without a word, he embraced the grieving mother, vowing silently that he would bring her child home. He knew then that he could no longer stand by and watch as the village's light faded. If no one else dared face the darkness, he would go alone. The following morning, Emory prepared for his journey. He packed only his essentials, a small loaf of bread, a flask of water, and his trusted hunting knife, worn from years of work, yet sharp enough to cut through bone. Before he left, he took one last look at the village. The faces that met his gaze were somber, filled with silent hope that his return would bring good news. He nodded, a determined glint in his eyes, and set off toward the forest's edge, where he had last heard of the shadow's appearance. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches casting long shadows over the path. Emory's senses were sharp, every sound alerting him to the forest's secrets. It was then, near a clearing bathed in thin streams of moonlight, that he noticed something on the ground, a scrap of cloth. Kneeling, he picked it up, a piece of a child's garment, torn and dirt-stained. His heart ached, recognizing it as the hem of Alice's dress. Holding the cloth close, he whispered a promise into the darkness. "I will find you, Alice. You are not alone." Emory rose and continued, each step drawing him closer to the heart of the forest. Strange marks littered the ground, a trail, faint yet traceable to the trained eye. He pressed on, his movements silent, his breath steady. And then he saw it, faint yet unmistakable, a shadow flitting between the trees ahead, moving swiftly and deliberately. Emory's pulse quickened, but he kept his composure, following the figure from a distance. It was as though the shadow could sense his presence, slowing down and disappearing just as Emory thought he would draw closer. Hours passed, and Emory's resolve was tested with each silent step. He had no allies here, only the oppressive weight of the forest and the echo of his own heartbeat. But he would not turn back. Finally, just as dawn's first light began to filter through the trees, he found himself at the edge of an ancient grove. A large oak tree, gnarled and ominous, stood at the center, its roots spreading outward like the fingers of a claw. Emory noticed symbols carved into the bark, old and foreboding, their meanings lost to time. Here, he knew, was the heart of the shadow's lair. But his discovery was interrupted by a faint sound, a whimper. Emory turned, straining to listen. The sound was weak, as if muffled, but unmistakably human. Steeling himself, he stepped deeper into the grove, searching for the source of the sound. And there, hidden among the twisted roots of the oak, was a small child, frightened and shivering. It wasn't Alice, but a boy from a neighboring village. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear as he looked up at Emory. "Hush, child," Emory whispered gently, kneeling beside him. "You're safe now. I'm here to bring you home." The boy nodded, clutching Emory's arm tightly. Through his sobs, he managed to stammer, "The man he took us. He keeps us in the cave. Please, sir, don't let him take me back." Emory's jaw clenched, his heart heavy with the weight of the child's terror. The cave. He now had a direction, and if one child was here, he knew there would be others. "Stay close to me," he whispered, pulling the boy to his feet. "We're leaving now, and I promise I will bring all of you home." As they moved away from the grove, Emory cast one last glance over his shoulder. The twisted roots and dark symbols felt like the promise of a battle yet to come, a silent challenge from the shadow himself. Emory gripped his knife tightly, feeling the enormity of the task ahead. He was no warrior, no hero of legend, but he was a man driven by love and justice. And that, he knew, was a force strong enough to face any darkness. The forest grew denser as Emory moved forward, with the young boy clinging close to his side. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the ancient trees felt amplified, as if the very woods were watching him, aware of his every step. Emory's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the boy's broken tale and the clues he had seen along the way. Somewhere within these woods lay the cave, a dark and terrible place where the shadow kept the children captive. Emory crouched down, placing his hands gently on the boy's shoulders. "Listen to me, lad. You've been brave enough to get this far. Now, I need you to do one more thing for me. Can you find your way back to the village?" The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though the forest itself might reach out to pull him back into its depths. I think so, sir," he whispered, his voice trembling. Emory gave him a reassuring nod. "Good. You go back as quietly as you can. Tell the others what you've seen, and wait for my return. I'll bring the rest of the children back, I swear it." The boy nodded, and with one last look of gratitude and fear, he darted off into the undergrowth, his small frame quickly swallowed by the shadows. Emory watched him go, feeling a surge of hope mixed with dread. Now, he was alone. He turned his gaze forward, deeper into the forest, where the faintest trail led further into darkness. Emory's grip tightened on his knife, and he moved forward, each step deliberate and silent. As he ventured further, an eerie quiet settled around him. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustle of small creatures, had faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then ahead he saw it, the entrance to the cave, partially concealed by twisted branches and thick vines. A dark maw in the earth, it yawned open, exuding a sense of malice. Emory's heart pounded, but he forced himself to take a breath, steadying his nerves. If he was to rescue the children, he had to confront whatever waited inside. He moved closer, careful to keep his steps light and silent. As he approached, he could make out faint voices coming from within, a child's muffled sob, a harsh whisper, and then laughter. It was low and guttural, reverberating through the cave, chilling him to the core. This was no ordinary captor. This was a man who took pleasure in his cruelty. Emory flattened himself against the rock wall outside the cave, straining to hear more. The voices were clearer now, and he could discern the cruel, mocking tone of the shadow, speaking to his young captives. "You thought someone would come for you," the voice taunted. "Who would risk their life for a few filthy village brats? Your own families have already forgotten you, little ones. Soon enough, you will forget them too." Emory's blood boiled. He knew now that he wasn't merely facing a kidnapper, but a man who thrived on fear and suffering. The thought of the children's terror made him clench his fists. He had to act carefully, for a single misstep could endanger the very lives he had come to save. Gathering his courage, he peered into the cave, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Inside, he saw several small figures huddled together at the far end, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. The children were chained to the walls, and the dim glow of a torch illuminated their faces, capturing their expressions of hopelessness and exhaustion. His heart wrenched at the sight. And then he saw the shadow, a tall, gaunt figure draped in tattered robes that hung loosely from his bony frame. His face was hidden beneath a dark hood, but his eyes glinted with a cruel light that pierced the shadows. In his hand, he held a long, twisted staff, adorned with strange carvings and symbols that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Emory took a step back, forcing himself to breathe quietly, steadying his resolve. He knew he couldn't storm in recklessly. The shadow's staff suggested powers beyond physical strength. Emory would need to use his wits, drawing on every ounce of courage and cunning he possessed. He moved back into the forest, searching the ground until he found a stone of decent size. Gripping it in his hand, he weighed his options, forming a plan. If he could distract the shadow, perhaps he could get close enough to disarm him, or at least create a momentary advantage. With one last steadying breath, Emory hurled the stone into the cave, aiming for a wall near the back where the shadows were thickest. The rock struck with a loud crack, echoing through the cave. Instantly, the shadow turned, his head snapping toward the sound, his grip tightening on his staff. "What was that?" he muttered, stepping toward the sound. Emory seized the opportunity, slipping quietly into the cave, hugging the wall as he moved closer to the children. He gestured to the nearest child, a girl no older than 8, signaling her to remain quiet. Her eyes widened in recognition, a spark of hope flickering within them. The other children noticed him as well, their expressions shifting from fear to cautious anticipation. But the shadow was no fool. His gaze snapped back to the children, and his eyes narrowed as he caught sight of Emory. "Ah," he sneered, "so the village sends a hero after all. Tell me, Woodsman, do you truly think you can face me? Do you even know what I am?" Emory met his gaze, standing tall despite the quivering in his chest. "I know enough," he replied, his voice steady. "Enough to know that you've no right to keep these children here. Let them go, and I might consider sparing you." The shadow's laughter filled the cave, a harsh, hollow sound that echoed off the walls. "Spare me?" he mocked. "You think yourself a hero? These children are mine, gifts from a world that has forgotten them. And soon, they too will learn to forget." Emory held his ground, refusing to be swayed by the villain's taunts. His mind raced, searching for any opening, any weakness he could exploit. He kept his eyes on the shadow, studying his movements, the way he held his staff, the faint glow of the carvings that pulsed with a strange energy. "Enough talk," the shadow hissed, raising his staff. "You may have come here to save them, but you will never leave this cave alive." With a swift movement, the shadow thrust his staff forward, and a wave of dark energy shot toward Emory. He threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast, which struck the cave wall behind him, sending shards of rock flying. Emory rolled to his feet, heart pounding, and charged at the shadow, hoping to close the distance before he could launch another attack. Their clash was intense, a struggle of strength and will. Emory's hunting knife clashed against the twisted wood of the staff, sparks flying as the two men locked eyes, each trying to overpower the other. The shadow's strength was unnatural, fueled by something dark and ancient. But Emory refused to yield. His mind filled with the faces of the children he had come to save, and he fought with every ounce of his being. The children watched in silent terror as the battle raged, their eyes fixed on the desperate struggle. Emory could feel his strength waning, but he pushed on, his resolve unwavering. At last, he saw an opening. The shadow had shifted his weight, leaving himself vulnerable. With a fierce cry, Emory brought his knife down, striking the staff and shattering it in two. The shadow staggered back, a look of shock crossing his face as the broken staff fell to the ground, its power extinguished. For the first time, Emory saw fear in his eyes. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough. Emory grabbed the nearest child, urging the others to follow as he led them toward the cave entrance. The shadow, still dazed, reached out in a futile attempt to grab them, but Emory shoved him aside, his strength renewed by the adrenaline of victory. As they emerged into the open air, the children clung to Emory, their faces streaked with tears of relief and gratitude. The shadow's furious scream echoed behind them, but he did not pursue, his broken staff lying lifeless on the cave floor. For now, they were safe. Emory knew, however, that the fight was far from over. The shadow would not rest until he had reclaimed his captives. And Emory, battered yet determined, resolved that he would be ready to face whatever darkness awaited him in the depths of the forest. The cool night air stung Emory's face as he guided the children away from the cave. Though they had escaped, Emory knew the shadow would not abandon his hunt so easily. The broken staff lay back in the cave, stripped of its power, but the hatred in the shadow's eyes promised a fierce and relentless pursuit. Emory led the children deeper into the woods, weaving through dense underbrush and towering trees, his heart pounding with every step. He whispered words of comfort to the smallest ones, though his own mind was clouded with dread. The forest around them was like a maze, twisting in unfamiliar ways, and the faint moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, seemed to pulse with menace. They hadn't gone far when he heard the telltale snap of a branch behind them. Emory turned sharply, his senses on high alert. He saw nothing, but a chill crept over him, and he knew in his gut that the shadow had already begun his hunt. Moving faster, he urged the children to keep close. Their breaths came in ragged whispers, and their faces were pale in the dim light, but none of them cried out. Fear had silenced them all. Soon, they came upon a clearing, where the remnants of an old hunting cabin stood in ruins. Emory glanced around, assessing its walls and the possibility of hiding within, but the sight of its crumbling wood and gaping roof made him hesitate. This was no safe haven. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. "Stay low," he whispered to the children, guiding them past the clearing and deeper into the shadows of the forest. His mind was racing. He needed to find a place to shelter them, somewhere the shadow couldn't reach. But the forest, once his ally, now felt foreign, as if it too had succumbed to the dark influence that the shadow carried with him. In the midst of their silent march, the smallest of the children tugged at Emory's sleeve. She was barely 6 years old, her face smudged with dirt and her eyes wide with terror. She pointed to something ahead, a faint glimmer of light through the trees. Emory frowned, unsure if it was a trap, but knowing they could not stay exposed any longer. He moved toward the light, his heart hammering, and the children followed close behind. As they drew nearer, Emory realized it was a small stream, its waters glinting in the moonlight. Relief washed over him. The sound of running water could help mask their footsteps. They crouched by the stream, taking a brief moment to drink, their small hands cupping the cool water gratefully. But as they knelt by the stream, Emory's instincts flared. He felt eyes upon him, and the silence around them had grown thick, almost suffocating. He scanned the shadows, catching a glimpse of movement on the other side of the water, a figure, cloaked and motionless, standing just beyond the trees. This shadow, his dark form was barely visible in the dim light, but Emory could feel his gaze, cold and unyielding. The children froze, their eyes widening as they too noticed the figure. Emory's mind raced. They had nowhere to run without revealing themselves fully, and if the shadow pursued them across the stream, escape would be impossible. Thinking quickly, Emory motioned for the children to move slowly behind a thick patch of undergrowth. He took a deep breath, then rose, stepping into full view, his hands clenched at his sides. If he could draw the shadow's attention, the children might have a chance to slip away unnoticed. Looking for someone, he called out, his voice steady, though his heart thundered. The shadow's head tilted, and though Emory couldn't see his face, he sensed the twisted smile behind that hood. "Brave of you, Woodsman," the shadow replied, his voice a low hiss. "But bravery does little against darkness. You've merely prolonged their suffering." Emory tightened his grip on his knife, forcing himself to stay calm. "Come closer, then," he challenged. "Show me just how much your darkness can do." The shadow took a step forward, his figure gliding across the ground as though he were one with the shadows themselves. But just as he was about to step into the moonlight, he stopped, a low growl escaping his lips. Emory followed his gaze downward and saw a thin line of elderberries scattered along the forest floor, forming a rough circle around the clearing. Elderberries, a simple fruit, yet in the ancient lore of the forest, they were known to repel dark spirits. Emory remembered his grandmother's stories about them, tales he had once dismissed as superstition. But now, he was grateful for every small advantage. The shadow halted just outside the circle, his hand extending as if testing an invisible barrier. His fingers twitched, and he drew back, hissing with frustration. Emory seized the moment. "Leave now," he called out, voice firm, "or face a fate darker than even your own shadow." The threat hung in the air, and for a fleeting moment, Emory thought the shadow might retreat. But instead, he laughed, a chilling, empty sound that echoed through the trees. "You think you can keep them safe with berries and threats?" The shadow sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "Foolish mortal, "You cannot stop what has already begun." With those words, the shadow stepped back, vanishing into the darkness as though he had never been there. But Emory knew he hadn't gone far. The shadow was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. Emory quickly motioned to the children, guiding them away from the stream and further into the forest, where the elderberries no longer offered protection. He knew their only hope lay in reaching the other side of the woods, where they might find shelter among the cliffs overlooking the village. But the journey would be long, and the shadow's presence weighed heavily on his every step. They continued on, their movements swift and silent. Every crack of a twig, every gust of wind, set Emory's nerves on edge. The children huddled close, drawing strength from his unwavering determination, though they could sense the tension in his every glance over his shoulder. At last, they reached a steep incline, the path winding upward toward the cliffs. Emory helped the children as they climbed, lifting the smaller ones over the rough terrain. His muscles ached, his breath coming in labored gasps, but he refused to rest. The top of the cliff would give them a vantage point, a place to see the shadows approach and plan their next move. When they reached the summit, Emory looked out over the forest below. The village was faintly visible in the distance, its lights twinkling like stars in the darkness. But closer within the trees, he spotted something that made his blood run cold, a trail of dark mist weaving through the woods, heading in their direction. The shadow was relentless. Emory quickly gathered the children around him, their frightened faces reflecting the weight of their predicament. He knelt before them, his eyes searching each young face, his voice gentle yet firm. "Listen closely, all of you," he said. "You must be brave. We're close now. Beyond these cliffs is a path that will take us to safety. But you must stay silent, and you must trust me. No matter what happens, keep moving." The children nodded, their small hands clutching each other's for support. Emory felt a surge of pride for their courage. He rose to his feet, his heart resolute. He would lead them to safety, even if it meant facing the shadow alone. But just as they began to descend the other side of the cliff, a thick fog rolled in, dense and suffocating, clouding their vision. Emory gritted his teeth, knowing it was the shadow's doing, a final attempt to disorient and trap them. "Stay close," he whispered, guiding the children through the fog, his senses heightened, listening for any sign of their pursuer. Then, from within the mist, he heard it, a soft, mocking whisper, as though the shadow were standing right behind him. "You can run, Woodsman," the voice taunted, "but you cannot hide." Emory's heart pounded as he urged the children forward, his hand gripping the knife so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could feel the shadow's presence closing in, the weight of the darkness pressing upon them. And yet, amidst the fear, a fierce resolve burned within him. He would not let the shadow take another child. Not tonight. Not ever. Pushing through the fog, Emory kept his focus on the path ahead, knowing that his own fear was nothing compared to the hope he carried for those he had sworn to protect. The fog thickened around Emory and the children, turning the world into a gray haze. Every step felt uncertain as he guided the small group, clutching their hands to ensure no one drifted into the shadows. Emory's heart pounded with every rustle, every faint whisper that seemed to come from the mist itself. The oppressive presence of the shadow was closing in, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then, the fog began to part slightly, and Emory saw a faint glow ahead, an opening in the trees that led to the cliff's edge. Relief surged within him. They had reached the final stretch. Just beyond, they could descend to safety and find their way back to the village. But as he ushered the children forward, a dark figure materialized in front of them, blocking their path. The shadow. He stood tall and menacing, his hood drawn low over his face, hiding everything but a glint of cold, calculating eyes. In his hand, he held a new staff, this one twisted and gnarled, radiating a dark energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. The faint carvings on the wood glowed an unnatural crimson, casting eerie shadows across his face. Did you truly think you could escape me, Woodsman? The shadow's voice was a hiss, full of venom and mockery. These children are mine. Their despair fuels me. Their fear strengthens me. And you, a mere mortal, think you can stand in my way? Emory felt the children cling to him, their small hands trembling with terror. He had no armor, no enchanted weapons, only his knife, worn and dull. But the resolve within him was unbreakable. He would face the shadow, even if it meant his own life. He had come too far to turn back now. Enough of this, Emory said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. These children deserve a life free from your cruelty. I won't let you take them. The shadow laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed off the rocks. You speak of freedom, of mercy. But mercy is a lie, Woodsman. There is only power, and I wield it without hesitation. He raised his staff, and with a swift, fluid motion, slammed it into the ground. The earth trembled beneath Emory's feet, and dark tendrils began to snake out from the staff, curling through the mist like the roots of a tree, reaching toward him and the children. Emory reacted instinctively, stepping in front of the children and holding his knife before him. The tendrils struck at him, but he slashed at them, severing the dark vines that clawed toward the children. Each strike felt like cutting through smoke, insubstantial, yet somehow alive. With each severed tendril, the shadow's eyes grew colder, his frustration palpable. Foolish Woodsman, the shadow spat, his voice laced with contempt. You cannot cut through darkness with steel. Emory knew he was right. His knife was merely a tool, worn and dull from years of use. But he had one advantage the shadow did not: the love of his village, the memories of the laughter of those children, and a heart that beat with fierce determination. He remembered his grandmother's tales, her stories of courage and defiance in the face of overwhelming darkness. And he realized that the shadow thrived not only on fear, but on isolation and despair. Drawing a deep breath, he lowered his knife and turned to the children, speaking loud enough for the shadow to hear. Listen to me, all of you. You are stronger than he is. You are together, and he fears that strength. Close your eyes, think of your families, think of the laughter you shared, the light of your homes. Remember who you are, for that is something he can never take. The children looked up at him, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. But slowly, they obeyed, closing their eyes, clutching each other's hands, their faces softening as they recalled the warmth and love they had known before the darkness claimed them. The shadow sneered, his staff trembling with dark energy. This sentimentality will not save them, Woodsman. Their fear is mine. Their hope is a dying ember. But Emory ignored him, focusing entirely on the children. He felt a surge of strength as he saw their expressions change, their trembling ease. And almost imperceptibly, the tendrils of darkness that had been slithering toward them seemed to weaken, their movements slowing, growing less substantial. Seeing this, Emory took a bold step forward, his voice unwavering. You have no power here, Shadow. Not anymore. These children's spirits are beyond your grasp. The shadow's face contorted with rage, and with a furious cry, he swung his staff in a wide arc. A wave of darkness shot toward Emory, thick and powerful, the air itself seeming to crackle with its energy. Emory barely had time to react. He braced himself, raising his arms in a futile attempt to shield himself from the blow. But then, something miraculous happened. The children's voices rose, soft but clear, as they began to sing a melody, a simple lullaby, one they all knew from their mothers and fathers. It was a song of warmth, of comfort, of home. And as they sang, the wave of darkness wavered, faltered, and dissipated into nothingness before it could reach Emory. The shadow staggered, his grip on the staff loosening as he stared at the children in disbelief. What is this?" he hissed, his voice filled with a rare note of fear. Emory seized the moment. He advanced on the shadow, his own voice steady and resolute. "Your darkness cannot stand against the light of their hearts. You have no place here, With a fierce yell, Emory lunged forward, his knife raised high. The shadow raised his staff to block, but Emory struck it with all his strength, shattering the gnarled wood into splinters. The dark energy that had once radiated from it dissipated, melting away like mist in the morning sun. The shadow cried out, clutching at the broken remnants of his staff as his form flickered, growing weaker, less substantial. Emory took a step back, watching as the once menacing figure of the shadow began to crumble, his edges dissolving into wisps of smoke, his power undone. This cannot be, the shadow rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I am eternal. I am darkness. Emory shook his head, his gaze steady. Even the darkest night must end. With those final words, the shadow collapsed, his form dissolving into shadows that scattered into the mist, leaving nothing but silence behind. The oppressive weight that had hung over the forest lifted, and the moonlight broke through the fog, illuminating the children and Emory as they stood victorious. Exhausted but relieved, Emory turned to the children, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. It's over, he said, his voice gentle. You are safe now. The children ran to him, their faces shining with tears of relief and joy, clutching at his arms, his cloak, thanking him with words choked by sobs. Emory held them close, his own tears glistening in the moonlight as he felt the warmth of their small hands and the promise of life that he had fought so hard to protect. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that they were safe. And as he looked out over the cliff's edge, toward the village in the distance, he knew that he had finally brought the children home. With dawn breaking over the horizon, Emory guided the children along the path back toward the village. The dark forest that had once seemed alive with menace now felt calm, softened by the morning light. The children clung to him, still shaken but hopeful, their faces streaked with tears and relief. They had endured a night of terror, but with every step closer to home, their small faces lifted with anticipation. The journey was slow, their feet weary and unsteady, but Emory's strength did not waver. His own exhaustion was profound, yet he felt a warmth in his heart that pushed him forward, as if the memories of the village, the sounds of laughter, the smell of bread baking in the morning, were guiding him homeward. When they reached the outskirts of Dunford, Emory saw figures moving in the distance, villagers standing on the edge of the fields, anxiously scanning the forest for any sign of life. He watched as a woman, Miriam, the mother of Alice, the little girl who had vanished first, lifted her head, shading her eyes against the early sunlight. Her face broke into an expression of disbelief, then joy, as she spotted Emory and the children emerging from the trees. They're back, she shouted, her voice breaking with emotion. They're back. The village erupted into life. Parents rushed forward, their faces a mixture of relief and astonishment, tears streaming down their cheeks as they called out the names of their children. Emory watched as mothers and fathers fell to their knees, embracing their sons and daughters, the cries of gratitude and joy filling the air like a hymn. Miriam clutched Alice to her chest, sobbing as she looked up at Emory with a gratitude too deep for words. Emory stood back, his heart swelling as he watched the reunions unfold. He felt a gentle tug on his sleeve and looked down to see Alice, her eyes wide and solemn. She reached up, taking his hand in hers, and murmured, "Thank you, Emory. You saved us." Her simple words warmed him in a way he couldn't fully understand. He knelt down, looking into her bright eyes, the spark of innocence and strength restored within them. "You're safe now, Alice. That's all that matters." The villagers surrounded him, their voices rising in praise and gratitude. Men and women clasped his shoulders, some weeping, others laughing through their tears, their words a mix of reverence and awe. "You are a hero, Emory," someone said, voice filled with admiration. "You have saved our children. You have saved us all." Emory shook his head, humility overcoming him. "I'm just a woodsman," he replied softly. "I did what any of you would have done. But the villagers, would hear none of it. They lifted him up, celebrating him as though he were a knight returning from a great battle. The children clung to him, their small hands clutching his tunic, reluctant to let him go. And in that moment, Emory felt something he had never known before, a sense of purpose, a calling that transcended his simple life. As the morning unfolded, the villagers gathered around, preparing a feast in his honor. Tables were set up in the village square, food was brought forth, and laughter filled the air once more. For the first time in many nights, the people of Dunford felt safe. Emory sat among them, surrounded by the children he had saved, their laughter a balm to his weary spirit. But even as he smiled, he couldn't shake the memory of the shadow's final words, lingering in his mind like a faint echo. Darkness, he knew, would always exist in some form, lurking at the edges of light. And yet, he had seen how even the smallest acts of kindness, the simplest gestures of hope, could drive it back. He had witnessed the power of courage, and the way it could transform the hearts of even the most frightened children. As the sun climbed higher, Emory felt a quiet peace settle within him. He knew he would return to his simple life in the forest, his days spent chopping wood and living humbly among the trees. But now, he carried with him the love and gratitude of his village, a bond that would remain forever. When the celebrations began to quiet, and the children finally drifted into sleep, Emory rose to leave. Miriam stopped him, her face full of emotion. She placed a small pendant in his hand, an old family heirloom, its surface etched with symbols of protection. "For you, Emory," she said, her voice choked with gratitude. "To keep you safe, as you have kept our children safe." Emory accepted the pendant, nodding his thanks. He looked around one last time at the village, the people he had protected, the lives he had helped restore, and a quiet smile spread across his face. As he walked back toward the forest, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, as if the forest itself were whispering its gratitude. He felt no fear, no darkness, only a calm, steady resolve that filled him as surely as the light of the rising sun. Emory, the woodsman, the simple man with a heart brave enough to face any shadow, returned to the woods, knowing that the true strength of a hero lay not in his power, but in his love for the people he called home. Days turned to weeks, and life in Dunford began to settle into a peaceful rhythm once more. The children, though scarred by their ordeal, returned to the innocence of play, their laughter echoing through the village as they raced along the paths and climbed the low stone walls. But in quiet moments, when gathered around the hearth or beneath the stars, they would speak in hushed voices of Emory, the woodsman who had saved them from the darkness. The villagers, too, held his story close to their hearts. Tales of his bravery spread beyond Dunford, reaching neighboring villages and distant travelers. Soon, his name became legend, a hero who, though lacking sword and armor, had fought a force more terrible than any mortal enemy. One evening, as twilight began to drape the village in shades of indigo and silver, Miriam gathered the children around the fire. She looked at each of them with a warmth that only a mother's heart could know, her eyes shining as she began the tale that had already become part of their lives. "Do you remember how he stood against the shadow?" she asked them, her voice gentle yet resonant. A simple woodsman, yet he walked into the darkest forest and faced the unknown, armed only with his courage. The children nodded, their eyes wide with reverence. Little Alice, who had been the first to vanish, leaned in closer, a glint of pride in her gaze. "He told us to remember our families, to remember who we were," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "He said the shadow couldn't steal our light." Miriam smiled, stroking Alice's hair as she continued. "Yes, and that is why he defeated the darkness. Emory taught us that there is strength in love, and that even the smallest light can drive away the deepest shadow." The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced across the children's faces. As they listened, their hearts swelled with a newfound understanding, a feeling that transcended words. Emory's story had become theirs, a lesson in courage and kindness, a reminder that even the most ordinary of people held within them the power to do extraordinary things. And as the seasons passed, the legend of Emory, the woodsman who saved the children of Dunford, grew. Artists and storytellers who traveled through the region heard his tale and took it with them, crafting songs and ballads to celebrate his bravery. Soon, even those who had never seen the village or met the humble woodsman spoke of him with admiration, sharing his story in taverns, at market stalls, and by firesides across the land. But Emory himself remained unchanged. He returned to his simple life in the forest, tending to the trees, gathering firewood, and living quietly among the wildlife he had always known. On rare occasions, he would venture into the village to trade or share a meal with friends, and the villagers would greet him with respect and warmth, treating him with the reverence due to a legend. Yet Emory never boasted of his deeds. When the children ran to greet him, he would smile, listen to their laughter, and tell them simple stories of his life in the forest. He spoke not of his battle with the shadow, nor of his journey through darkness. To him, the story was theirs now, a gift he had left behind, woven into the heart of Dunford, to be cherished and passed down through the ages. One winter's night, many years after the events that had forever changed the village, an elder recounted the story once more, this time to a gathering of villagers who had grown up hearing it told and retold. The elder's voice was soft, but filled with conviction as he spoke of Emory's courage, his selflessness, and the light he had kindled within the village. As he finished, a young boy, seated close to the elder's chair, raised his hand, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Is Emory still out there in the forest?" he asked, his voice tinged with wonder. The elder looked into the boy's eager face, and a gentle smile touched his lips. "Perhaps," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "Some say they still see his shadow among the trees, watching over us, ensuring that the darkness never returns. And perhaps that is the way of true heroes. They are never far as long as we carry their stories close." The boy's eyes sparkled as he glanced toward the edge of the forest, where the trees stood tall and silent, their branches stretching out beneath the starlit sky. In his heart, he knew that as long as they remembered Emory, the woodsman would live on, his spirit woven into the very roots of Dunford, his legacy as enduring as the trees he once tended. And so, Emory's tale became part of the village, a reminder that courage could be found in the most unassuming of people, that love was stronger than fear, and that even a single soul could hold back the shadows. For as long as stories were told, the legend of Emory, the humble woodsman who faced the shadow, would continue to shine, a beacon of hope, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. As generations passed, the story of Emory, the humble woodsman, became an ancient tale, recited by elders around the fire and cherished by children as they fell asleep. Emory's name was now a legend, a symbol that guided and inspired all who heard it. Many who grew up in Dunford claimed to feel his presence in the peaceful air of the forest, and some young, courageous souls swore they had seen his shadow walking beneath the trees on nights when the moon was full. But it was in the actions of the village itself that Emory's influence was most visible. Inspired by his kindness and bravery, the villagers became guardians of the forest and the values he had represented. They learned to care for each other with the same dedication that he had shown to them. Every winter, when the nights grew longest and the cold settled upon the land, the villagers would gather to celebrate the night of the legend, a ceremony in Emory's honor. Children who had been rescued by Emory, now grown old themselves, attended with their grandchildren, sharing the tale of the man who had faced the unimaginable to bring them home. On one of these nights, a young girl named Alana, a descendant of one of the rescued boys, approached the ancient tree that marked the edge of the forest, carrying a promise in her heart. Inspired by Emory's legend, she had decided to follow in his footsteps and become a protector of the village and its woods. Standing by the old tree, she whispered a prayer. "May I have the courage of the woodsman and the strength to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The moonlight illuminated her face, and for a moment, Alana felt she was not alone, as if the forest itself had blessed her, as if Emory's spirit remained ever watchful, ready to guide those who needed him. Emory's legend would live on, not merely as an old tale, but as an eternal inspiration, a reminder that even the humblest among us carry a light powerful enough to hold back the darkness.